Okay, tonight we have Jason Smith, who's been here a couple times, and he's going to be talking about Moby-Dick, an American myth. And Jason was an undergrad in theater at the University of British Columbia, and he was an actor for a while, and that's where he ran into Jung, and I'd love to hear that story. And then he decided, he got so interested, he decided to go to Pacifica and become a therapist. And then he met his wife at Pacifica, and he came to Boston, where he's part of the Jung, C.G. Jung Institute-Boston. Now it's called the Institute of New England. And he was the director of the training board, and he's a faculty member there. And he teaches, and he is the creator and host of Digital Jung, which he told me is a companion to his new book, which is Religious but Not Religious, Living a Symbolic Life, which just got got published by Chiron this last fall, right, Jason?
Yeah, right.
Okay, and he's an analyst in Manchester by the Sea. Aren't we all curious about Manchester by the Sea? That was the name of the movie, wasn't it? Manchester by the Sea? Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jason, please.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. So I was getting prepared to come here and do this talk, and I was rushing out with family, and I said, I'm going off to do a talk on Moby-Dick. And my son said, all those writers in the 1800s, did they really have all of that symbolism in their writing? Or is that just like English teachers analyzing things too much? I think all the symbolism's there, and he really wasn't buying it. But we're going to dig into the symbolism. We're going to trust that it's there, and we're going to dig into some of that symbolism tonight. One of the things that I often do is I spend a lot of time kind of leading into the talk and then feel like I'm rushing at the end. I probably have far too much material. This is a huge book, so there is far too much material. So I may do a little rushing at the beginning to get us into the meat of things and then slow it down. I'll stop a few times for questions, and we'll dig into some part of this book. I'm going to flip over to a PowerPoint and let that guide some of our discussion here. So let me just quickly go to share screen here. All right. So as I was saying, this is a huge book. I have taught this before for a class of analytic candidates, and we spent 5 classes, 3 hours per class, 15 hours going through this, and we barely got through it. We have 2 hours tonight, and there's an enormous amount of material. So we're going to have to make some choices and kind of circumscribe our ambitions for what we're able to do tonight. And I'm going to draw out one fragment of the whole book and all of the images, and hopefully that fragment will give some glimpse of the whole. And if you are familiar with Moby-Dick, that's good. You'll kind of be able to follow the different pieces. I'm going to be jumping around in the story a little bit. If you're unfamiliar with Moby-Dick, there may be a few spoilers in this, but maybe it will be some inspiration to kind of dig into the book itself. There's a chapter, midway through the book, chapter 104, actually, I guess 2/3 of the way through the book, called The Fossil Whale. And in that chapter, Ishmael, one of the main characters of the story, is describing his attempt to what he calls manhandle a whale. He's in his own pursuit for the whale, the way that Ahab is in pursuit of the whale. But he's going at his pursuit in a different way. And he's doing things like measuring skeletons of the whale and understanding the mythology of whales and whaling, and just digging into his subject from every possible angle. And in that chapter, he says this, he says, "In the mere act of penning my thoughts of this Leviathan, of the whale, they weary me and make me faint with their outreaching comprehensiveness of sweep, as if to include the whole circle of the sciences and all the generations of whales and men and mastodons, past, present, and to come, with all the revolving panoramas of empire on earth and throughout the whole universe, not excluding its suburbs. Such and so magnifying is the virtue of a large and liberal theme. We expand to its bulk. To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme." So we have a mighty theme and a mighty book to look at. And it does cover that whole sweep. It does cover the whole universe and into the suburbs of the universe. And like I say, we're going to have to kind of focus and narrow our focus. This idea that we expand to its bulk, in talking about the whale and in the creative process, part of what we're going to talk about is what does that do to us and what does that mean? And Ishmael and Melville saying that we expand to the bulk of this theme, that the theme kind of carries us and expands us and enriches us and fills us with all of those things, the panoramas of empire on earth and the whole universe. Jung says this about the creative process, about the creative process and the artist. He says, the creative process, so far as we are able to follow it at all, consists in the conscious activation of an archetypal image and in the elaborating and shaping of this image into the finished work. By giving it shape, the artist translates it into the language of the present and so makes it possible for us to find our way back to the deepest springs of life. By giving the archetypal image shape, the artist translates it into the language of the present, and so makes it possible for us to find our way back to the deepest springs of life. We expand to its bulk. Jung says we deepen to the depth of the springs. So Melville writes this book on the whale, on Moby-Dick, and it is just such an archetypal image. It's a symbol in the true sense, and I think it has the potential in connecting with it to bring us into, to help us find our way back to these deepest springs of life. One of the things that Edward Edinger says about Moby-Dick, he wrote a book, a commentary on Moby-Dick from a Jungian perspective. And he says about the book, he says, this book is palpitatingly alive. It is awesome in the intensity of the depths that it reveals. So I hope we can start to get a taste of that, some sense of the depth that this reveals. Jung talks about two different kinds of art, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. He has a couple of essays on analytical psychology and poetry, and analytical psychology and literature. And he delineates two kinds of art. One he calls psychological, which the editors point out is probably best understood as personalistic, and the other is visionary. And the personalistic or the psychological, he talks about that as it's a kind of work of art that works with materials drawn from man's conscious life, with crucial experiences and powerful emotions, suffering, passion, the stuff of human fate. And all of this is assimilated by the psyche of the poet and raised from the commonplace to the level of poetic experience. So it takes all of those passions that we know about, all of those experiences that we have some sense of, and raises them to a poetic level. The second kind of art is the visionary art. And what he says about visionary art is it comes from a different place. Personalistic art or psychological art, there is no obscurity that surrounds them. They are what they say they are. They fully explain themselves on their own terms. But with visionary art, he says it's something strange that derives its existence from the hinterland of man's mind, as if it had emerged from the abyss of pre-human ages, or from a superhuman world of contrasting light and darkness. So there's a strangeness to it, and it comes from this hinterland, right? What he calls the collective unconscious. The artist reaches down, in a sense, into the collective unconscious and restores some value that we have been cut off. Art compensates the collective values of a culture the way that dreams compensate the particular values of an individual. It brings a compensatory balancing and an attempt to bring equilibrium back into the cultural psyche. The visionary art does. He says further, he says, it's a primordial experience, the visionary art, which surpasses man's understanding and to which in his weakness he may easily succumb. So if we don't connect to this deep material, it's still there and it's still active, and we may succumb to it. It may overtake us in some way. The very enormity of the experience, he says, gives it its value and its shattering impact. So there are depths here, right? Remember what Edinger said about this book being awesome in the intensity of the depths that it reveals. And Jung's judgment of Moby-Dick is that he includes Moby-Dick as one of the greatest, or to be, he considers it to be the greatest American novel in this kind of class of art. It's a visionary novel as far as Jung is concerned. So we want to dig into this and see if we can get a feel for the archetypal, the symbolic, and what it might be pointing to, what it might be compensating, what it might be expressing about. I've said, I've called this an American myth. So what it might express about the American psyche. But if we really think about that, the American psyche has kind of penetrated through almost all of the world. It's global in many ways. It's found its roots in far outside just the United States. So we want to look at that and see what it has to say about that. Melville talks in Moby-Dick in one of the chapters. I think it's the chapter called The Grand Armada. And it talks about this area where there are all of these treasures and jewels and spices, which the landscape in particular, he talks about as hiding them from the all-grasping Western world. That's part of the myth that we're talking about here, that Ahab and the whole whaling pursuit is part of that all-grasping Western world. So the book starts very famously with Ishmael, who starts off by saying, "Call me Ishmael." So we don't know if Ishmael is his real name. He's inviting us to call him Ishmael. He's identifying with that character. We'll talk about that character in a bit. And right off the top, Ishmael gives us what I think is, in a sense, kind of the presenting problem of the novel. And he says this: "Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to the sea as soon as I can." And then he says, "This is my substitute for pistol and ball." So here's the presenting problem: damp, drizzly November in the soul. And of course, this looks like and it sounds like depression, right? We have all of these images of involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses, bringing up the rear of every funeral, and then going to sea as the substitute for pistol and ball. Going to sea is a kind of dying to self. And we'll talk about that in a bit, that he substitutes for a literal suicidal impulse, pistol and ball, the ball being the bullet in the pistol. But the rest of the chapter, so we have this sense, right, that there's something feels very depressive. The rest of the chapter goes into this reverie about water. And Ishmael starts to talk about the draw to water. He says, all people are like this. It's not just me, Ishmael, who's drawn to the ocean and drawn to the water. It's all people. And he recounts all of these different ways in which people are drawn to what he calls the extremist limit of the land. And he wonders what it is about this magnetic draw of the water. Why are so many people drawn to the water's edge? Nothing will content them, he says, but the extremist limit of the land. Now, this image of being drawn to the extremity, being drawn to the limit of something, being drawn to our edges, the edges of our experience, and to this place where we hit the water's edge. And in that passage on water, he says, meditation and water are wedded forever. So for Ishmael, it's this place of reverie, it's this place of meditation, it's this place of the deep interior. And Jung says about water in one of his essays on the archetypes of the collective unconscious, one of the things Jung says is that water is a living symbol of the dark psyche. And what he's talking about in that passage, in that essay, is that he says, in our time, the access to spirit is no longer accessible above, right? That spirit no longer comes from above through fire and in those ways. He says it comes from below. Spirit is not fire, but it's water. He says we live in a time of spiritual poverty. And if we can be honest about that spiritual poverty, it leads us, he says, by the way of the soul. And this leads us to the watery depths, into the psyche. So the recovery of spirit is like in Melville at the edge of the water. It's going to the water. And really what this is talking about is meaning. What looks like depression in this instance is this longing, this deep need for meaning, for some sense of a connection between our everyday life and something beyond us, something larger than us, something that connects us to each other, to the world around us, to the universe. We need that meaningful connection to life. And this is what Ishmael is seeking in the water. And he says as much, right? He says about all of these people heading towards the water and heading towards the extremist limit of the land. And he says, surely this is not without meaning. Surely all this is not without meaning, and still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life. And this is the key to it all. What are we looking for? What are people searching for? The image of the ungraspable phantom of life. The image that he brings in with Narcissus points to one of the potential dangers of this, right? Do we get caught on the surface? Do we get caught in the immediate image, the surface image? Do we get caught in looking at things through our own lens, through what it means to me? And are we missing the life behind the surface of things, the life below the surface, the ungraspable phantom of life? All of these people heading towards the water. What are they looking for? It's the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, the life behind the surface. Jung in 1959, in an interview that he gave, says exactly the same thing. He says, we must try to approach the living truth behind things. The living truth behind things. It's mankind's oldest effort. So this story, this book, starts off with this image of searching for that ungraspable phantom of life, the living truth behind things. One of the things that Jung says about the artist is that there is a need to there's a need for the culture, there's a need for the collective to be connected to something like that ungraspable phantom of life. And it's the artist who often will go into those depths and pull out that meaningful image for the rest of us. And in this story, I want to suggest that Ishmael is something like that artist, that in his sense of something missing, he's going to the water to find something. Jung makes this this statement in his book on art and artists, or his essay on the relationship between psychology and art. He says, direction implies exclusion. And exclusion means that very many psychic elements that could play their part in life are denied the right to exist because they're incompatible with the general attitude. Something's missing. The normal person can follow the general trend without injury to himself, but the one who takes to the back streets and alleys because he cannot endure the broad highway will be the first to discover the psychic elements that are waiting to play their part in the life of the collective. They're waiting to play their part. And here the artist's relative lack of adaptation turns out to his advantage. It enables him to follow his own yearnings far from the beaten path and to discover what it is that would meet the unconscious needs of his age. And this is really a description in some way of Ishmael, right? He is the one who takes to the back streets and alleys. He takes to the water because he cannot endure the broad highway. And he is the one who has that relative lack of adaptation. It takes everything he can, right? He says in that sort of opening paragraph, to prevent himself from stepping into the street and starting to knock people's hats off. He can't play his part. And so there is something missing, and he needs to go and find it. And in some way, we could see his journey as something like what's called an anachoresis. An anachoresis is what the monks did when they withdrew from society into the desert. And the separation that was involved wasn't just about getting away from people geographically, but it was a spiritual journey into the desert. Because the desert was the place where both the demons that had to be overcome, where they lived, and it was the place where the soul could make progress and the place where God could be found. So you have to go into the desert, you have to go into the wilderness to overcome the demons and to reconnect to that ungraspable phantom of life. I'm just going to go through a couple more slides here, and then we'll have a few questions in like 3 minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about this split. The title, as you can see on the slide, is The Splintered Heart. And that image will come back, and I'll explain the image down the road a little bit. But this idea of direction implies exclusion, that there is some split, something lost, something that we are cut off from. This is a quote from a theologian named Raymond Panikar, and he's a very interesting character, and his writings are dense and complicated but rich. There's a lot that is very similar to Jung. He has a very similar sensibility to Jung and a similar density in his writing. And he's a Catholic theologian and priest, and also he has a Hindu background. His father's Hindu, his mother's Catholic. He's a major figure in sort of interfaith dialogue and interfaith understanding, and he brings in all of these different understandings from these different traditions and cultures, because he uses words and words from other languages to convey ideas that can't be conveyed in English. So it's a really interesting body of work that he has. But he talks about our current state of being embedded in this view of scientific materialism. And he talks about the need for manipulative experiments, right? That the way the experiment works is it's an interference in the natural process. It's not a natural process. It's the way that human beings actually interfere with nature and disrupt it in order to kind of get an answer out of it. And he talks about this as a manipulative approach. He says the need for manipulative experiments for the sake of gaining insight and under the pretense of utility is, culturally speaking, a pathological need. And he talks about things like, experiments on animals and the way that we make use of other things as objects in order to squeeze information out of nature. And he says the experiment presupposes a distorted image of the human being, a distorted image of humankind. And the distorted image that we have is that we're not part of nature. The distorted image is that we're outside of nature, acting on it, and that we are not embedded in nature. And so we're cut off, and this is something similar to what Jung talks about, how our consciousness cuts us off from our deeper instincts. We're cut off from our connection with our own nature, our inner nature, and with nature around us. And we don't recognize that we too are part of that ecosystem all around us. And he goes on to say that after holding the mythical holistic worldview for a time, people are now trying, and have been for the past 3,000 years, to grasp reality by means of splitting, abstracting, and specifying it. He says, the time has come to when the fractured pieces of these partial insights must be put together in a new holistic worldview. So he's talking about the split in us. And we'll see that split in both Ishmael and Ahab in a minute. and the way we engage life through splitting. And Jung says something very similar. Jung says this, and this comes from that same interview that I mentioned before. In our time, it's the intellect that is making darkness because we've let it take too big a place. Consciousness discriminates, judges, analyzes, and emphasizes the contradictions, and it's necessary work up to a point. But analysis kills, and synthesis brings to life. I want to pause on that for just a second. Analysis kills. Jung's psychology is called analytic psychology. It proceeds by way of an analytic method, and it comes out of psychoanalysis. But every now and then he makes the statement that analysis on its own can do damage. Analysis kills. Synthesis brings to life. We must find out how to get everything back into connection with everything else. We must resist the vice of intellectualism and get it understood that we cannot only understand. Okay. That is where I'm going to pause now and see if there are any questions. I'm going to take this off the share for a moment. And maybe if there are questions, you can type them in the chat and Andy can.
The chat is open.
The chat is open. Are there any questions at this point? No need for questions because we can just keep rolling on.
Looks like we have no questions at this point.
Okay. All right. Good. I'm going to push on from here. All right. So how do we confront this split? How do we confront this alienation in our own souls, this disconnect from nature, from our nature? Oh, hang on. There we go. Again, this is from Jung's essay on art, on the relation of psychology to, I believe it's the one on poetry. It's either poetry or literature. Talks about, in order to grasp the meaning of the work of art, we must allow it to shape us as it shaped the artist. Then we can understand. So it's not an intellectual understanding, right? We have to let the art affect us. We have to experience through the art something close to what the artist has experienced. What I want to suggest is that that this is kind of a general principle in terms of the need for some kind of participation, some kind of reconnection, some kind of engagement and relationship with that ungraspable phantom of life. The artist has plunged into the healing and redeeming depths of the collective psyche, where we are not lost in the isolation of consciousness and its errors and sufferings, but where all people are caught in a common rhythm which allows the individual to communicate his feelings and strivings to humankind as a whole. So this is the work of art, the connection to those depths, is that place. It creates the possibility of our connection to each other, our connection to the universe, and our connection to the natural world around us, and to our own depths. And it's that the need to recognize our embeddedness in the other, that we are not isolated beings, that our reality always involves an other. It always involves a context. Who I am in this moment involves this setting. It involves all of you. I'm not separate from this experience, so I'm not separate from your being here and listening and engaging this material as we're talking about it. We can't keep ourselves protected from the world, from each other, if we're going to connect to these depths. This is going to define in some way the difference between Ishmael and Ahab. And the main people that I'm going to be looking at tonight, Ishmael and Ahab, and some of the other characters as they relate to those two. This is, again, Ishmael describing the whale, and he's looking at all of these different images of the whales. One of the things that he says as he's looking through these different ways that the whale has been depicted in image and picture is that they don't capture the essence of it. They don't capture the truth of it. And he says that if you really want to engage and know the living whale in his full majesty and significance is only to be seen at sea in unfathomable waters, right? To grasp the meaning of the work of art, we must allow it to shape us as it shaped him. We can only get the full experience in those unfathomable waters, right? In those depths. It has to be an engagement. It can't be something that we stand back from and think about. We have to be engaged in a full embodied way. He says, because of this, for all of these reasons, any way you may look at it, you must needs conclude that the great Leviathan is that one creature in the world which must remain unpainted to the last. The whale must remain unpainted to the last. There is something unknowable about this whale. This whale is a true symbol. There's something about these depths, about what lives in the waters, that ungraspable phantom of life. There is something unpaintable about it. It can't be known. It can be met, but there's always something that is unknown. Jung's definition of a symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be expressed in any other way. It doesn't describe exactly what it's trying to describe, but it's the best possible expression, and the symbol gives us a relationship to the depths behind it. The whale, the images of the whale are not the true whale. This is an image that comes up in religion all the time. The image of God is not the same as God. The image that connects us to God is not God. Meister Eckhart, in order to get to God, you have to leave God. You have to leave all understandings of God. And then he says, the only mode in which you can derive even a tolerable idea of the whale's living contour is by going a whaling yourself, right? You have to go into the unfathomable waters. But by doing so, he says, you run no small risk of being eternally stove and sunk by him. It's not necessarily safe. We encounter living realities, and they are powerful, and those living realities, even in our engagement with other people, they will have effects on us, and we will be touched by them. We will be affected by them. There are dangers in here. It's not without some need for caution, need for staying awake, keeping open eyes. Jung talks about two ways of doing this connecting to the depths, to the unconscious. And the way that Jung talks about them is that on the one hand, you can be surprised by it. You can succumb to it, and you can be swallowed up by it. And this is the way of psychosis. It can overtake you, and you can lose your bearings in those depths. The other route is by way of what Jung calls an anticipated psychosis. You enter into the same experience, you enter into the depths deliberately and consciously, so that you're not overtaken by them, but you go in with eyes open into the same dangerous conditions. And this idea of being swallowed by the unconscious, this idea of psychosis, it's a little disturbing to think about and talk about. But there are different ways to reflect on this, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. One of the things that Jung says is that the reason to do this, the reason to engage in this dangerous task of going into the depths, is to be able to bring up the compensatory content that we talked about with the artist. And he says, and thereby produce a whole meaning which alone makes life worth living. To bring up the meaning which alone makes life worth living, right? The ungraspable phantom of life. And he says, and for not a few people to make life possible at all. Life is hard. Life is a struggle. Life has suffering all through it. William James has an essay in which he titles it, and he asks the question, is life worth living? And he talks about in the deepest hearts of human beings, there's a place where life works sadly. There are these depths, and there is this pain. And if we look around the world, and if we open our eyes and pay attention to even one small section of the world, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain. And for Jung, it's what's in those depths. It's connecting to that meaning that makes life worth living, and for not a few, makes it possible at all. And then he goes on, this is in his work, Mysterium Conjunctionis. He goes on to say that in myths, the hero is the one who conquers the dragon, not the one who's devoured by it. But both have to deal with the same dragon. And he says, also, he is no hero who never met the dragon, or who, if he once saw it, declared afterwards that he saw nothing. Only the one who has risked the fight with the dragon, risked the fight with one's own depths, who's gone into themselves, into the experience of the psyche. I keep saying inside ourselves, but it's more than that. And we'll talk about that, hopefully. Only the one who has risked the fight with the dragon and is not overcome by it wins the hoard, the treasure hard to attain. We look at Ishmael and Ahab. They are both in the fight with the dragon. The dragon we could look at as an analog of the whale. And in fact, Melville talks about Leviathan, right? It's the monster of the deep. There is a dragonish quality in here. He says, only the one who has risked the fight with the dragon and is not overcome by it. There are different ways to overcome the dragon. There are different ways to overcome the whale. Ahab's attempt at overcoming the dragon is to kill it, to seek it out and murder it, to seek revenge on it. But there's a phrase in this line by Jung that I think is important and significant. The one who has risked the dragon and is not overcome by it. One way to conquer the dragon is not necessarily to kill it, but not to be overcome by it. To survive the experience, to face one's own depths and not be overcome by it and not have to kill them off in some way. In the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic text, there's this saying, number 70, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. That's the fight with the dragon. If you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. And if you don't, what you don't bring forth will destroy you. So again, we're talking about meaning, how we relate to life. We can talk about what that dragon is, what the whale is. And the question that I think is in this book all the way through is the dragon or the whale a symbol of chaos? So in mythology, the high god battles the dragon or the serpent, and that's a symbol of chaos that needs to be overcome. And the high god kills that serpent and order is brought. So is Moby-Dick, is the whale a symbol of chaos to be overcome and destroyed? Or is it a symbol of nature and the life of the depths that needs to be nurtured? That's the question, I think, the heart of this story. And what Jung talks about, there's the quote from Jung in the Myths of the Hero. What Jung talks about, he puts his language in the terms of psychology, right? He talks about psychosis, and he talks about, he sort of casts it in the frame of pathology. But if we take his intention and not his words, if we take what he says as a symbol or as a metaphor, we can recast the same idea in terms of religion, right? And think about it as how we reflect on how we participate in the life of the cosmos. The idea of religion here not being a content of belief, but an attitude of engaging life, of doing what Jung calls careful observation and scrupulous attention to the numinous, or of having a dependence on and a submission to the irrational facts of experience. That's how Jung describes religion, that it's a way of engaging life more deeply. It's not a way of putting beliefs about what life is. It's more of a question. It's what I talk about in my book, that religion can be understood not as a thing, but as an attitude, right? And not as an answer to the questions about the universe, but the very questions themselves. It's the questioning that we put to life and to the universe. So how do we participate in the cosmos? Can we join in the cosmic dance, right? Or are we broken by the suffering of life? We can cast the same idea in terms of our relationship to the natural world. Are we part of nature? And are we participating in the rhythms of nature? Or do we stand outside of nature and use it for our own purposes? Which also extends, by the way, to using other people for our own purposes, or even making use of our own psyches for our own purposes, going into our dreams and digging up an image and having that image help us make some improvement in our lives, where we put the psyche and the image and the symbol in service of the ego. And so in a sense, everything boils down to how we meet our own depths, how we live our own lives, how we enact each and every moment. Our lives, all the ancients tell us, are microcosms, are a microcosm of the universe. It's not unlike Jung's message, right? That the collective is made up of individuals. And it's whether those individuals are conscious, are alive, are sensitized to their own depths, that will have an effect on the nature of the collective and the culture. And so we have our own work, our own development, psychological development, spiritual development is an indispensable and an important responsibility that we carry. Raymond Panikar says, the climax of life is, in my opinion, to participate in the life of the universe, in both the cosmic and divine symphonies to which even we mortals are invited. It's not only a matter of living, but also of letting life be. This life that is offered to us as a gift so that we may sustain and deepen it. Life is a gift that is given to us so we may sustain and deepen it. And I think this image of the whale is just this, the life of the universe, the life of the depths. And it's approached very differently by Ahab and Ishmael. I'm going to go past this and I'm going to move on to Ahab and Ishmael here. This is an image of Ishmael being in the Bible. Ishmael is the first son of Abraham. Abraham and his wife Sarah can't have a child. She is old, he is old, she is barren. And so he has a child with one of the servants, Hagar, and that child is Ishmael. But then God opens Sarah's womb, and Sarah, at somewhere around 100 years old, is able to have a child. and Isaac is born, and Isaac is the true heir, and Ishmael and Hagar are sent out, cast out. They become the outcasts. And Ishmael, when I was looking for images of Ishmael, it's interesting. It's hard to find just an image of Ishmael, certainly the biblical Ishmael, on his own. Ishmael is always pictured with Hagar. So Ishmael is the outcast. He's the wanderer. He's the he's pushed out. But his name is interesting. The name Ishmael means God hears. So even though he's the outcast, there's some connection, there's some depth, some relationship to the divine. And then Ahab. Ahab was a famously evil king, one of the kings of Israel, idol worshiping king. And it says of Ahab in the Bible that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So Ahab's a bad guy. He's done more evil than any in the eyes of the Lord, than any before him in the eyes of the Lord. Ahab hates Moby-Dick. Ahab is seeking vengeance on Moby-Dick. Ahab has confronted Moby-Dick in the past. And in that confrontation, he lost his leg. So he has a whalebone for a leg. And he is impassioned with a desire to wreak vengeance on Moby-Dick. And his first mate, Starbuck, is shocked by this. So Ahab gathers the whole crew together in the chapter called the Quarterdeck, and he kind of mesmerizes them all and inscripts them all into joining him in the quest to pursue and kill Moby-Dick. And Starbuck is just aghast, the first mate. And Starbuck says, vengeance on a dumb brute that simply smote thee from blindest instinct. That's madness to be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab. It seems blasphemous. And Ahab's response is, he doesn't care if the whale knew what he was doing. He's going after whatever was behind behind that impulse of the whale. And what he says is this. He says, the inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. So was Moby-Dick the agent of the action? Did Moby-Dick intend it? Or was Moby-Dick the actor and there was some force, God or fate or something behind it? But whatever it is, that mystery, that unknown, that ungraspable phantom of life, that inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. The thing that he cannot have an impact on, that he cannot reach, that he cannot influence, he cannot bear. And so he's filled with vengeance. Ishmael's experience is entirely different. Ishmael in the first chapter says that he wants to go to sea, and he gets it in his head that he's going to go on a whaling voyage. And he experiences that call as a call of fate or providence. And he doesn't really know why, but it's just the next thing that's going to happen in his life, and he follows the call. And he says, chief among my motives for going on the journey was the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused all my curiosity. Then the wild and distant seas where he rolled his island bulk, the undeliverable, nameless perils of the whale, these, with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds, helped sway me to my wish. See, Ishmael's language here is the language of awe. He's driven by the curiosity. He's driven by the mystery. He's driven by the sense of marvel. He's responds with a quality of wonder. And it's those two ways of responding that create two very different fates. I want to talk a little bit about Ahab. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ahab, and then I'm going to stop for a few questions, and then we'll kind of push towards the end. So let me describe Ahab a little, because already we see different ways of engaging the whale, which are different ways of engaging that ungraspable phantom of life. The description of Ahab when we first meet him in the novel is his whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze and seemed to be shaped in an unalterable mold. That's mold is spelt wrong there, by the way, like Cellini's cast Perseus. An unalterable mold. There's something fixed about Ahab, right? There's something that is immovable about Ahab. And that unalterable quality. And there's this image, right, of Perseus that Melville brings in here. And again, the question comes up, you know, that question of, is the whale, the dragon, the image of chaos that needs to be killed, or is it nature that needs to be nurtured? And the other question that comes up, at least that speaks to me here, is Ahab Perseus in pursuit of the Gorgon, in pursuit of that agent of chaos? Or is Ahab the Gorgon? Is he, in fact, that agent of fixity, of the fixed idea, the fixed purpose? In that scene that I mentioned about on the quarterdeck where he gathers all the crew there, so much talk about the eyes and the way he stares at all the crew. And in particular, the way he stares at the three mates, Starbuck, the chief mate, and then Stubb and Flask were the others. And Starbuck's resistant. But Ahab stares them down, and it says, it seemed as though by some nameless interior volition, he would have shocked into them the same fiery emotion accumulated within the Leyden jar of his own magnetic life. He would have shocked into them. The Leyden jar is a jar from sort of the early period of experiments, these jars with electricity going into them and sort of jumping back and forth. And it's as if Ahab is trying to put something into the three mates to force them into his purpose. And they all back down. Stubb and Flask look away, And the honest eye of Starbuck fell downright. They can't take that glance. They wither. In a sense, he turns them to stone to a certain degree. Ahab has a mark on his body, this sort of lightning-like mark. And it seems to kind of go down the length of his body. It goes across his face and it disappears into his clothes. And Melville or Ishmael describing it says it resembled that perpendicular seam sometimes made in the straight lofty trunk of a great tree when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it. So it's this lightning strike. And then later at the end of the same chapter describing Ahab and the birthmark, he describes Ahab as a thunder-cloven old oak. And these images connect Ahab with Zeus, right? The oak, the lightning. But again, here's the question. Is Ahab Zeus fighting Typhon, the dragon, the serpent of chaos? Or is he Typhon? The other possibility in here too is that what's happened to Ahab is he's become so identified with Zeus. He's become the god. And this we'll see soon. He usurps the place of the god. And that split that we talked about before, that split in our own psyches, that alienation of the human from the rest of nature, from life, is marked on Ahab's body. He embodies, personifies that split. It's right down his very visage. The other detail about Ahab is talks about these two holes that are bored into the deck, auger holes about 1/2 inch in the plank. And he puts his whalebone leg in the hole. And he holds on to a shroud. There's another death image for you. And he looks out straight. And it says, there was an infinity of firmest fortitude, a determinate, unsurrenderable willfulness in the fixed and fearless forward dedication of that glance. I mean, just listen to that language. Firmest fortitude, fixed, fearless forward dedication. There's something fixed about Ahab. And in fact, it's so fixed. He's got his whale leg in the auger hole. What's going to happen if he starts to walk with that leg in the auger hole? All he can do at that point is pivot around one point. His mind is fixed around one point, one focus. And that's the white whale. He is fixed. There's another image that this contrasts with. And the contrast here is Ishmael. And Ishmael's position on the ship is at the masthead. And Ishmael goes up to the masthead, and he, up there, his job is to look out and spy the whale that they will then lower and go and try to capture and kill. So he's up on the masthead. But what happens to Ishmael is up there, he can't hold his focus. He's not fixed like Ahab. He says, let me make a clean breast of it here and frankly admit that I kept sorry guard. With the problem of the universe revolving in me, How could I, being left completely to myself at such a thought-engendering altitude, how could I but lightly hold my obligations? So up there, Ishmael is on the masthead overlooking the ocean, and he's not looking for the whale to kill. He's not really focused on that. The problems of the universe are revolving in him. Ahab is revolving around his pivot hole, but the problems of the universe revolve in Ishmael. And what happens is, where Ahab is fixed, Ishmael disappears. Ishmael is an image of self-emptying. He disappears, and up there on that masthead, he says, at one point, he loses sort of all sense of himself, and he says, there is no life in thee now, except that rocking life imparted by a gently rolling ship, and by her borrowed from the sea, and by the sea from the inscrutable tides of God, right? Ishmael becomes one with the universe, from himself to the ship, to the ocean, to God. Whereas Ahab stays disconnected and focused on his one fixed forward dedication. So let me pause here. Let me stop this. And before we kind of do the last sweep of things, see if there are any questions at this point.
Please type your questions in the chat. Here's a question. What about that word monomaniacal?
Right. That's that fixed purpose. I'm wondering what the sense, what's your idea about that word that you're asking?
It's repeated in the book many times as a characteristic of Ahab's pursuit.
Yes. Well, right. You know, there's a way in which there is that sort of monofocus, right? The monomaniacal thing, but it's one fixed piece. And we'll talk about this in a minute. Ahab has one focus. Ishmael will say, I try all things. Ishmael's view is much more, you might say, pluralistic, much more open. That monomaniacal piece has something of the quality in we might talk in Jungian terms of a kind of ego overtaken by the self. The ego has become kind of swallowed up by the self and become inflated in a kind of catastrophic way. There's no separation from the drive and the desire and the focus, and there's no other image, and so there's no dialogue. There is just one fixed purpose, and And I think that connects with that sort of fixed quality, that firmness, that unalterable aspect of Ahab. He cannot be changed. He will not be changed. So he can't be transformed. He can't grow.
So here's a question from Richard Brady. Is the split of humans from the universe also a split from the past and the future?
That's interesting. That's interesting. I haven't thought about it in terms of a split from the future. Jung certainly talks about it in terms of being cut off from our past, being cut off from, we live in a time of constant novelty and everything is new and the past is old, and we live, he says, in a world of statistical truth, but that is not enough for us. We're only alive when we live in the world of our own mythological truth, which is to be rooted in the past, rooted in a sense of kind of where we come from. I'd have to give more thought to the future. I'm not sure.
And Christine asks, what about the way Melville seems to drop Ishmael out of sight as a personal narrator? We no longer experience him as a person as we did in the first few chapters.
Right. I think that's really interesting. It's sort of, he kind of disappears, though he comes back in places. But that's part of Ishmael's, the image of Ishmael is that there's something, he's sort of, on the one hand, he's kind of like the every person, the one that we connect to, but he's also, there's something self-emptying, and we'll, hopefully we'll have time, we'll look at this, where he's someone who has, in a sense, died to self. That's part of his journey. And it's part of the reason, I think, that he actually survives the story. He is the one survivor. And that's connected with his relationship with Queequeg, which I'll look at in a moment. But there is that kind of, the way that he, on the masthead, kind of becomes one with the universe. There's that kind of quality where Ahab is so fixed, Ishmael is still that on the outside, the outcast, and he's always kind of out there.
From Judy, Ahab wants to kill whatever is behind the whale. Is it because he doesn't understand it, can't conquer it, is afraid?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question, and I think those are questions that you can definitely ask. One of the things that Ahab can't bear, it seems, is to be subject to anything, is to be subject to another person, to be subject to fate, to be subject to death, to be affected, and to be changed, and to have his will bent in any way. seems intolerable. And actually, maybe we'll go on from here and we'll pick up questions in a little bit, because to a certain extent, this is Ahab on some level represents that quality of that is reinforced in our lives today and in culture, that sort of where there's a will, there's a way, and our resistance against against the impact that life has, against being changed, against being affected and transformed by others, by the world around us, by our own experience. Let me go on and we'll come back, because I know we've got about 25 minutes. So I'm going to, I may skip over a couple of things, but I want to cover this here. So a little more about Ahab. Ahab follows the iron way, right? And what he says is, what I've dared, I've willed, and what I've willed, I'll do. He is all will. And it's not just that his will, there's almost no resistance against that anymore. There's nothing outside of that. He says, they think me mad, Starbuck does, but I'm demoniac, right? He's possessed. I am madness maddened. I am madness maddened. And the thing with Ahab's madness, it says a little bit later, as in his narrow flowing monomania, not one jot of Ahab's broad madness had been left behind. As in that, not one jot. So in that broad madness, not one jot of his great natural intellect had perished. That before living agent, his intellect, that before agent, the intellect that chose and made decisions, now became the living instrument. His intellect, his intelligence is now subject to his madness. His madness drives, and his intellect has no kind of bearing against it. And this is an image from an artist who did some illustrations of Moby-Dick, Gilbert Wilson, of this phrase, I am madness maddened. You just see that lightning strike down his face. And these images of Ahab slowly going mad kind of in these drawings just continue to break open. It's just stunning image. And not only is he mad and possessed, he does not want to be subject to life at all. And so after his scene on the deck, where he gets all of the sailors to sign an oath to his quest, there's a chapter called Sunset, right? Sunset. The sun's going down, the consciousness is going down, the intellect is being subject to the madness. And in that chapter, he defies the gods themselves, and he taunts them. And he says this. He says to the gods, come, Ahab's compliments to ye. come and see if ye can swerve me. Swerve me? You cannot swerve me, else ye swerve yourselves. Man has you there. Swerve me? The path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails whereon my soul is grooved to run. Over unsounded gorges, through the rifled hearts of mountains, under torrents' beds, unerringly I rush. Naught's an obstacle, naught's an angle to the iron way. He will not be swerved. He's that image of that in us that says, you know, we're not going to be held back by the sort of the restrictions of nature. I mean, we'll figure that out later. We'll clear cut for now. You think you can swerve me? I'm just going to take what I want, and we'll figure it out later. You know, there's a part of the way that we engage life that's this. The path to our fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon the soul is grooved to run. And this compares to what Jung talks about. He says, what's true of humanity in general is true of each individual, for humanity only consists of individuals. And he says, the First World War brought a terrible reckoning with the rational intentions of civilization. What is called will in the individual is called imperialism in nations. For all will is a demonstration of power over fate, the exclusion of chance. Civilization is the rational, purposeful sublimation of free energies brought about by will and intention. So that iron rail, those train tracks, the sublimation of free energies by will and intention. And it's the same with us as individuals. Ahab is an image of this. And just as the idea of a world civilization received a fearful correction at the hands of war, we're not so civilized as we think we are. So the individual must often learn in his life that so-called disposable energies are not his to dispose. The disposable energies, the things that we think are ours, are the gods, right? The archetypes. And Ahab is saying, I'm not subject to that. I will override that. The danger, of course, is that you have those fearful corrections. And the danger in this story is that Ahab takes the whole Pequod down with him. His quest costs the lives of everybody. Our civilization, what will that do? And who does that take down with the ship? And will anybody survive? We're all on the Pequod, right? Things are very different with Ishmael. Ishmael also has his experience of the split. And there's a sequence where we hear something of that. We hear a sequence where he goes through this sort of civilizing process with his stepmother. And then he meets Queequeg, who's a Maori. And this is an image on the PowerPoint. This is the original Queequeg. This is someone that Melville met in his travels. And Queequeg is tattooed on the face and on the body. And they have to share a bed when they first meet. And they begin to get to know each other. And Queequeg is described as self-collected, right? Queequeg is whole, he's not split. And it's Ishmael's relationship with Queequeg that heals him. And as he engages with Queequeg, he says this. He says, I began to be sensible of strange feelings. I felt a melting in me. No more my splintered heart, there's that splintered heart imagery, and maddened hand were turned against the wolfish world. This soothing savage had redeemed it. Ishmael touches that deep instinct, that original indigenous kind of relationship with the world that Queequeg represents. We can't get into it tonight. Whale Rider is a story of the Maori, which is the same tribe as Queequeg. And it's a young girl who redeems her tribe by coming into relationship with the whale. It's lovely. Queequeg comes from that place. Look at the imagery. My splintered heart. There's the split. The split that's on Ahab is healed in Ishmael, his splintered heart. And where Ahab's madness maddened, Ishmael's maddened hand is no longer turned against the world. He is healed where Ahab is devoured by the dragon. One of their nights together, sleeping together, they share a pipe. Queequeg has this pipe, which is kind of half tomahawk, half pipe, and they share it. And then it says, when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me around the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning in his country's phrase that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me if need should be. We were married. There's this conjunctio, this conjunction between the two of them, a conjunctio, a bringing together of the opposites. Ahab, by the way, also has a pipe, and he throws it overboard because he says, I'm done with serenity. I throw this pipe away. So what Ishmael and Queequeg share, Ahab throws away. Queequeg and Ishmael go forehead to forehead, which is a Maori greeting, and they show this greeting in the movie The Whale Rider. It's shown between the chief and his son. They touch foreheads, and it's shown between the young girl and the whale. She touches foreheads with the whale. But this is what Ahab says when he's going out to hunt Moby-Dick. Towards the end of the story, he says, forehead to forehead I meet thee, Moby-Dick. So his forehead to forehead is to kill, not the forehead to forehead of marriage and meeting and becoming bosom friends. We don't have a lot of time. I want to say a couple things here. Queequeg's tattoos. These lines show up. There are hieroglyphic marks on the whale's skin, and they're comparable to Queequeg's tattoos. And then Queequeg at one point looks like he's dying, and he gets into a coffin that's built for him, and then he doesn't die. He kind of resurrects. He's kind of a Jesus figure in this story. And then he carves these markings on the coffin. So the markings on the coffin are similar to the tattoos on his body. And at the end of the story, when the Pequod goes down, there's a kind of vortex, and out of that shoots the coffin, which is now a life buoy. It's been turned into the life preserver on the boat, and it shoots up out like a whale breaching. And Ishmael is able to climb onto the coffin, and he's saved by Queequeg's coffin. and he lies on that coffin. And you can imagine the impression of those lines and those carvings of the coffin getting into Ishmael's skin. He's tattooed in a way, the way Queequeg is. And we find out later, actually, that he does get himself tattooed. As he's going about and he's measuring whales, he finds a spot on his body that's not yet tattooed to tattoo the measurements of the whale. He tattoos the whale onto his skin. There's an identity with the whale, but it's not the identity of being swallowed up like Ahab. There's a way in which it's integrated. And he wants to save some space for tattooing because he's got a poem that he's composing that he's going to write on his skin. So this tattooing and this connection, Ishmael and Queequeg are united. They're married. Ishmael integrates these aspects of Queequeg. I'm going to go through a couple things really quickly. We talked about Ahab's iron way. What I've dared, I've willed. What I've willed, I'll do. And this contrasts with Ishmael's mystic surrender, right? Ishmael says, I try all things. I achieve what I can. He doesn't have that same all will. He is more in a relationship with life and with the universe. And part of this is that he says, when I go to sea, I go as a simple sailor right before the mast. It's this self-emptying. It's this kind of self-denial in a sense. There's something very ascetic about him. And he's not trying to be something. In a sense, he's trying to be nothing, which is that's very much what the mystics and the monks work at, kind of overcoming of self. And then he has this other experience, right, where he's rowing as one of the oarsmen in the boats going after the whale. And it's this treacherous thing, and they almost die, right? Going not after Moby-Dick, but after a whale earlier in the story. And when you're rowing, you're moving backwards, right? And so he comes out of that, and he's just kind of still in the throes of almost having lost his life. And he asks Flask, one of the mates, he says, will you tell me whether it is an unalterable law in this fishery, Mr. Flask, for an oarsman to break his own back, pulling himself back foremost into death's jaws? You have to go backwards into death's jaws. Ahab stands with the harpoon and ready to strike at the whale. Ishmael is going backwards into death's jaws. And Mr. Flask says, basically, yes. So what Ishmael does is he goes down and he writes his will, and he has Queequeg witness it. And after that, he feels released. He's already died. He's let himself die to self. And therefore, he can now be responsive to life, right? Those who lose their life will find it. And those who will not lose their life or who seek to hold on to their life will lose it. That's Jesus in the gospel. Goethe says, so long as you haven't experienced this, to die and so to grow, you are only a troubled guest on the dark earth. Let me just do a couple of last slides. I'm going to skip over this one. I want to talk quickly about the scene of the monkey rope. At one point in the story, they've captured a whale. Queequeg has to stand on the whale and kind of help slice off the layer of blubber. But it's dangerous, and the whale is tipping, and he can lose footing. So there's a rope tied around him, and On the other end is Ishmael on deck, holding the other end of the rope in order to keep Queequeg alive, if possible. And this monkey rope, this connection, is this powerful image where he says, I seemed distinctly to perceive that my own individuality was now merged in a joint stock company of two, that my free will had received a mortal wound. This is something that Ahab could never allow. His free will can never receive a mortal wound, right? Another's mistake or misfortune might plunge innocent me into unmerited death, disaster and death. I thought that this situation of mine was the precise situation of every mortal that breathes. We are all in an interdependent relationship with each other. This is true in our relationships. If you're in a committed relationship, what happens to the other person happens to you. If that person gets sick, that sickness is in the relationship. It's in the family, right? Our free will in being connected with each other receives a mortal wound. And there are those who can't accept that. I don't want to have my free will taken from me. I want to have my freedom. But there's this give and take between freedoms, between my freedom and your freedom. The way that I treat the earth has an effect on how you experience the earth and vice versa. And Ishmael says, nor could I possibly forget that do what I would, I only had the management of one end of it. And this is Jung. Jung says this, right? He says, the conscious achievement of inner unity, overcoming that split, clings to human relationships as to an indispensable condition. Individuation is not about us. It's not about us and who we become. Individuation is something that actually is an overcoming of the self in some way, because the ego gives way to a greater self, and that greater self connects us to the larger self. And when Jung here talks about clinging to human relationships, we could talk about the relationships with other human beings. We could also talk about the relationship with the planet and how we treat nature and the climate catastrophe. We could talk about the relationship with the universe and fate and how we have that kind of give and take with fate, with God, however we experience that, to let ourselves be changed by the numinous. Religion, Jung says, is characterized by a consciousness that has been transformed by its encounter with the numinous. It's the change, it's the transformation. It's not me having a belief changing you. It's me encountering the universe and being changed by it. That is religion from Jung's point of view, to be changed, to be affected. Without acceptance of our fellowship, there can be no synthesis of personality. And then he says at the end, the inner consolidation of the individual is not just the hardness of the collective man on a higher plane in the form of spiritual aloofness and inaccessibility. It emphatically includes our fellow man. There is I won't talk about it now, but there's a sequence where Ahab is described as being inaccessible and only being nominally amongst the human race. There is more, and there are depths, but I want to give a little bit of time. I know we're right at the end. I want to give some time for questions if there are any others. So let me stop this and open it up to any questions.
Here's a question from Gregory. You started with a child's question, your son's question, which is a good one. Might your son be asking if the author did the writer put symbols in it deliberately, or was he in a kind of dream while he writes it?
Yes, that's, thank you. That's actually an excellent question, because that's exactly the question he did ask me. He said, did those writers mean to do that? And I don't know if he gets that idea that are they in a dream and the symbols are discovered. D.H. Lawrence said about Melville that his best writing had a dreamlike quality. And there's this way in which I think that's what happens, is that's Jung's idea of the artist goes down and they don't choose things and bring them up. In a sense, the symbol comes to them or drives them, leads them. They find the symbol, or the symbol finds them.
Excuse me, Andy, are you going to open the chat?
We're right at time, Chris, and we
Oh,
have a number of
Okay, so
questions.
it's not going to be open. Okay.
Here's one more from Julie. To many people, the whale is a symbol of the self and can evoke a numinous feeling. I don't understand why he wants to kill it. Look what happened to him so that he became, or like what happened to him so that he became like this and wanted to kill? Is it because of trauma, or is he possessed by some archetypal force?
Well, I think you could certainly look at it in terms of trauma, and in terms of, so if we look at it through that lens, through the trauma lens, we could understand that the need to preserve some vital sense of self is going to defend against anything that wants to challenge it. That self becomes fragile and afraid of falling apart. It's not the best description, but essentially. But we could also look at it sort of symbolically and wonder, for me, it's partly about how have we turned to the things of this world, and we look at them in terms of their use. Like the whale is seen as a source of oil. That's why they're going out whaling, to kill whales in order to get oil to sell, right? And so things don't have intrinsic meaning of themselves. Things are not seen as being inherently meaningful. They're seen as being what one writer calls instrumentally rational, right? They're instrumental, they're utilitarian, they're for a purpose. You look at a tree, it's for something, fuel, building, but it's not a living being. And so Ahab is, in a sense, kind of that tendency metastasized, right? Exaggerated. Melville sees him as a sort of a Shakespearean tragic character who is so possessed. But he can't see the other. He can't. In fact, one of the things that he says about the connection, the interdependence, is he can't bear it. He says, cursed be that mortal interindebtedness which will not do away with ledgers. He can't stand that when his leg breaks, he has to go to the carpenter and the blacksmith and rely on them to provide him something. He wants to be so self-reliant and so sufficient as to not need anybody at all. And Starbuck tries to reach his humanity and to look into his eyes. And there's a moment where Ahab feels his humanity and he misses the human world. all he can manage is one tear. One tear drops in the ocean and it's gone. And then he looks away from Starbuck and he says, no, I will not be swayed from my purpose. So that sense of being changed and transformed is unbearable.
Thank you, Jason. I wish we could continue to talk. We have wonderful questions. So thank you. And yeah, this has been quite a night. And this will be recorded and you can go to our audio archives on our website and whenever it gets done. And so you can listen to it again or whatever, or tell people about it. And thank you. So we really appreciate any donation you can afford. So good evening, all, and sleep well. Have a good
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
So how was that for you, Jason?
That was fast. Like 5 minutes.
I thought you did a really good job, really bringing in the characters and the story, and it's complex. It's a very complex story.
It's very complex. There's so much that I'm unable to get. It's